Hannibal crossed the Alps with the intention of fulfilling a sacred childhood oath to see Rome vanquished. His decision would plunge the Republic into a prolonged war for its very survival, bringing devastation to the entire Mediterranean and ultimately resulting in ruinous consequences for Carthage. When hostilities ceased in 201, Rome's victory brought with it unprecedented new wealth and commercial opportunities. But though it would have been apparent to few at the time, these rewards would prove to be a poisoned chalice for the Republic. Rome's triumph had come at a great cost, not just in lives lost, but in a fundamental restructuring of Roman society, which had been required to achieve and maintain a posture of total war for nearly 2 decades. But more significant changes were still to come. The destruction wrought by Hannibal led to the decline of the class of freeholding Italian farmers that formed the core of the legions and their allies. As Romans and Italians alike surveyed the ruins of their farms upon demobilization, many decided to sell the land and migrate to cities as they were unable to invest the capital necessary to bring their land back up to its productive capacity. Naturally, those with the resources to accept short-term losses for long-term gains were the wealthiest members of Roman society, so the large estates became even larger, and free labor was gradually replaced by the massive influx of foreign slaves the legions had captured in their conquests. It was the brutal exploitation of these foreign conquests from the conclusion of the Second Punic War onwards which injected new wealth and also cultural influences into Roman life, as the Republic evolved from a regional power into an overtly imperial state. We must stress that this transformation was not merely one of scale that came with new territory and resources, but was one of scope. The economic revolution brought about a fundamental shift in economic organization and class dynamics, the influences of which, combined with the domestic trends already underway to greatly increase the complexity and stratification of Roman society, so that within a few decades the composition of Rome's productive base diverged significantly from the simpler agrarian-based economy of earlier periods. A direct through line can be drawn from the far-reaching impact of these social, political, and economic changes to the Republic's eventual collapse. Political revolution was the natural consequence of the economic revolution. For the acquisition of new territory resulted not just in increased production, but also in greater differentiation and specialization of Roman agriculture, because Rome began importing more cheap grain from the provinces. Large landowners increasingly turned their attention away from dietary staples and towards more profitable crops, such as wine and olive oil. Subsistence farmers and even small landowners were increasingly unable to compete, exacerbating the growing divide among agricultural producers that was already well underway with the growing importation of foreign slaves. The virtually limitless supply of cheap labor comprised of the enslaved and an ever-increasing pool of disenfranchised provincials would also encourage the elite to diversify their revenue streams by investing in industrial enterprises. With the legions securing access to new markets on favorable terms, Roman merchants and moneylenders could accumulate wealth that far surpassed what their forefathers had been capable of achieving. Naturally, these changes to the economic base directly impacted the superstructure of Roman society. The replacement of a primarily agrarian economy with one that was increasingly money-based and financially fluid would alter societal norms and values to accommodate the new streams of accumulation and accept cultural, religious, and political influences from across the Republic's increasingly diverse empire. Wealth and cosmopolitanism became intertwined, with Greek learning becoming increasingly fashionable, and a new appetite for the luxuries of the East that were now within reach for the nouveau riche Romans. But not all were ready to accept these changes, and the stubborn refusal to diverge from the sacred traditions of the past is personified in Cato the Elder, a man who relished nothing more than lording his own simple living and unwavering devotion to the ways of the ancestors over those who embraced the ostentatious luxuries that their newfound wealth and influence afforded them. Cato's political ideology was shaped by a profound distrust of the ongoing cultural and economic transformations that threatened what he viewed as the glorious traditions of the Republic, and he found it baffling that new generations of Romans would seek to emulate the cultures and peoples that Rome had conquered. After all, hadn't their defeat at the hands of the legions been all the proof that was required to invalidate the merits of their society? Or, in the words of Cato's role model, Manius Curius, that it was better not to possess gold, but to possess those who possessed the gold. This naturally brought him into direct conflict with the new class of aristocrats that championed Hellenism, chief among them Scipio Africanus. They sang the praises of Greek art, literature, and philosophy, but to Cato, these trappings of civilization were pure decadence and only threatened to impede Rome and undermine what he perceived as the stalwart foundations of the Republic upon the virtues of the smallholding farmer. For Cato did not just find Greek culture personally unappealing, but he sought to remove its influence from Roman society entirely. He saw Hellenism as a corrosive force that threatened the simplicity and sacredness of Roman life and morals. He was wholly averse to philosophy, and made mock of all Greek culture and training out of patriotic zeal. He says, for instance, that Socrates was a mighty prattler who attempted, as best he could, to be his country's tyrant by abolishing its customs and by enticing his fellow citizens into opinions contrary to the laws. He made fun of the school of Isocrates, declaring that his pupils kept on studying with him till they were old men, as if they were to practice their arts and plead their cases before Minos in Hades. And, seeking to prejudice his son against Greek culture, he indulges in an utterance all too rash for his years, declaring, in the tone of a prophet or a seer, that Rome would lose her empire when she had become infected with Greek letters. Cato would attack displays of wealth and luxury with a similar enthusiasm, committing himself to dressing simply and living in a relatively modest home. To Cato, morality was synonymous with personal austerity and commitment to Roman traditions. He viewed service to Rome as a literal religious obligation, and throughout his entire public career, he never wavered in this commitment. His tumultuous tenure as censor brought him into conflict with senators and equestrians who he regarded as too preoccupied with luxurious living to make worthy Roman leaders. He even expelled a man from the Senate for kissing his wife in public. This stand against what he viewed as a corrupt elite that was betraying founding Roman values endeared him to the masses, and Cato enjoyed a remarkably successful political career, even becoming the first in his family to achieve the consulship, making him a novus homo, and securing eternal distinction for his descendants. Cato was proof that successful populism need not actually offer any concessions to the downtrodden or the working class, that simply representing a recognizable alternative to a corrupt and hated elite would suffice. Though he adopted anti-populist rhetoric, such as when he inveighed against a proposed corn distribution program by saying, "It is a hard matter, my fellow citizens, to argue with the belly, since it has no ears." He was popular. His assent was proof that cultural grievances and general malaise could be channeled all the way to the consulship itself. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. But, despite Cato's commitments to halting what he perceived as the decline of Roman morals and traditions in the face of foreign influence, his efforts would ultimately prove unsuccessful, and he is seen as the last holdout of an older, dying era, as a new world struggled to be born. Rome would develop further from his agrarian ideal, and future generations would only become more influenced by foreign culture, with Greek literature and philosophy eventually becoming so seamlessly grafted into the ideology of the Roman ruling class that Cato's great-grandson and intellectual heir, Cato the Younger, was a firm adherent of Stoicism, a Greek philosophy that the elder Cato reviled. In a few short generations, even staunch conservatives were embracing the cosmopolitan foreign influences that Cato spoke out against. As Horace would later write, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror, and brought the arts to rustic Latium." Furthermore, though Cato the Younger would intentionally mimic the aesthetics of simplicity that his forebearer had cultivated, his closest supporters in the conservative faction of the aristocracy wholeheartedly embraced the luxuries that their wealth offered. Cato and his life were reduced to an aspirational ideal, noble in its own way, but not something any man of means truly sought to emulate with any consistency. But why did Cato's moral stand fail so spectacularly? To understand why Rome chose to turn its back on Cato's warnings, we must look first not at the importation of foreign ideas, but to the shifting productive base of Roman society. Simply put, the agrarian mode of production was being rapidly supplanted, and thus it is natural that the customs, religion, and ideology that had grown up to attach values and meaning to these practices also began to wither, with a new ideological superstructure springing up to accommodate and accompany the material reality that now existed in Rome. For, though Cato obviously railed against foreign ideas, he was at best inconsistent in his opposition to these productive changes, and at worst a hypocrite, for, despite a hatred of luxurious living and his constant praise of the poverty of Rome's honored ancestors, in his private life, Cato would devote himself to the ruthless and single-minded acquisition of profit. His surviving treatise on agriculture provides an effective manual on how to achieve maximum profit at minimum investment. In the work, Cato advocates planting cash crops that can be sold at the highest possible prices, instead of harvesting the cereals that made up the bulk of the Roman diet. In addition, Cato outlined how to work slaves at peak efficiency, showing no concern for the human tools he owned, and only providing the bare minimum needed to keep them alive and working day to day. He demanded that his slaves either work or sleep, ordering them to never stand idle while awake, and it was his practice to sell his slaves the moment they became too old to work productively, so that there were no superfluous mouths to feed. This was viewed as overly harsh, even in the exploitative slave-owning society of his time. Cato's slaves were given a new set of clothes only every other year, and received a new blanket on alternating years as well. So, if minimal living was indeed a Roman virtue, Cato was far surpassed in this by the slaves whom he forced into a rigid and demeaning Spartan lifestyle. Despite his praise for agriculture as morally superior to commerce and money-lending, Cato would strategically expand his economic portfolio and even openly flout the Lex Claudia, which was passed to prevent senators from engaging in commerce, utilizing intermediaries to obscure his financial involvement in the shipping industry. Cato, then, was not the principled traditionalist that he is presented as. He simply honored the laws and customs that he felt he ought to follow. His moral code was centered around preferences, not principles, and personal advancement in place of abstract ideals. For, in his business practices and reliance on slave labor, how was his behavior truly distinct from his peers? He was just as committed to making money through the altering of the productive base of Roman society, but just had qualms about how it was to be spent. One wonders if a Roman farmer, driven off his land because he was unable to compete with Cato's slaves, felt reassured that at least the arch-conservative would not spend the ill-gotten money on Greek tutors for his sons. But in addition to advancing the economic practices that were chipping away at the old Roman ways of life, Cato was also quite famously a cheerleader for imperial expansion. More than any other man, he bears responsibility for Rome's pitiless and unnecessary eradication of Carthage, ending nearly every speech with the declaration that, "Furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed." His desire to secure Roman hegemony resulted in a genocide that removed Carthaginian civilization from the Mediterranean world for the mere crime of its existence, provoking fear and resentment in the Roman heart. Either Cato understood the destabilizing effect that the income, slaves, and war booty brought in through foreign conflict was having on the Republic, and he was complicit, or he was ignorant of these wider impacts, but either way, it is hard to come to the conclusion that he is worth listening to for any insight into moral decline. Scoundrel, hypocrite, or ignoramus. Take your pick. But Cato has to fall into one of these categories. Cato was blinded by his focus on ideas and not material production as the driving force behind the rapidly changing complexion of Roman society. His inability to divorce himself from his own financial interests and innate prejudices meant that he was addressing only half the problem in his tirades against luxury and Greek culture. Worse yet, he was addressing a symptom of Rome's change and never the cause. How was anyone to see him as anything but a curiosity, when he was just as driven to acquire profit as they were, but just had an aversion to actually using his newfound wealth? It is little wonder, then, that in the years after his death, his incoherent and unattainable message was defanged, and the man turned into a caricature that could act as a symbolic stand-in for old Roman virtues. The actual man and his criticisms had fallen out of favor with the elite, who now simply picked and chose which aspects of his ideology they would selectively apply. The victory of the Hellenists was total, and again we must state just how peculiar it was that Cato the Younger would claim to be his great-grandfather's standard-bearer, while also rigidly adhering to the thoroughly Greek philosophy of Stoicism. The first Cato, then, was a tragedy, and the second a farce. All recent efforts to resurrect Cato and his message of attempting to cope with societal change through a puritanical war against new ideas alone are only destined for a similar failure.